struggling through this text because I'm 9 years old and I have no context for what is being written, and I really didn't know what I was reading. And I only found out about 3 years ago when I moved back here and started working with these texts again, is that it was a translation of the August Richter history, which got banned. And I was reading a typescript from the 40s or 50s with proofreading marks and everything in it. So that was really my first experience. But Davenport has so many other historians. About 15 years ago, I read a book by Sharon E. Wood called Freedom of the Streets. And this is the gold standard in research and writing in Davenport history. And it really inspired me to begin studying that again and reading it. And that eventually led to me moving back here after 25 years in New York. So I owe a lot to these people, and this, I hope, will come through in the presentation. The staff here at Richardson Sloan, you kind of have to be here to do this research because of all the resources that they have. And Catherine, Katie, and Christina are really fun to work with and always very, very helpful. Same with Christina, Chris, and Kelly at the Putnam Museum. I got a lot of background information from Professor Bruce Walters and Professor Kristen Quinn regarding art history and interpretation. If I make any errors, Bruce is here. If I make any errors, Bruce, it's my fault. It's not Bruce's fault, all right? Corey Darnall and Scott Christensen are excellent historians, particularly of Davenport's German element. And I don't have a lot of that in here, but the information that they've given me over the years has been really, really helpful, and it's background to what I do here. Last, but certainly not least, my partner, Angel Matthias, is an outstanding photographer and also my partner in really everything. And the support that I get from him is way more than just great photographs. It's really everything. I couldn't do this without him. So thanks to Angel, who I think is with us online. He had to travel for work this weekend. So with that, let's get into our topic of clearing tangled underbrush. 3 blocks east of this building, just beyond the overpass of the former Rock Island line, Davenport's East End stands quiet watch over the site of the Black Hawk Treaty of 1832. Here is the origin of Iowa and of its first metropolis. For 175 years, this ground was off limits, unknown, unnoticed, and hidden in plain sight, first by industrial development, and then by post-industrial blight. The constant changes, excavations, rezonings, and redevelopments of the East End have obscured momentous events that happened in this small triangle of real estate. After several generations of retellings, Davenport's early history now resembles the nearly vacant lot that stood at the treaty site for the last 50 years. Overrun by weeds and underbrush, an impenetrable thicket of confusing references, gaps, wishful thinking, non sequitur, and error. Given the recent surges in interest, quality scholarship, and publication, our subject deserves better. In 2024, a 4th redevelopment of the area is in progress and a new neighborhood appears. For the first time in 150 years, we can again walk the ground. So perhaps now is a good opportunity to revisit and clear out and prune the canon just as we reimagine the land. Let's start with a look at the map, because maps make things look so easy, sometimes deceptively so. The Black Hawk cessation was the instrument, the legal instrument the federal government used to take possession of the tribal lands in yellow. This little green parallelogram here along the Iowa River That was Keokuk's reserve. This was held out of the 1832 treaty. They would revisit this in 1836. We'll come back to that. At the time of the Black Hawk Treaty, there were only 4 states in this region. Everything else east of the Missouri River was Michigan territory. And over the course of just even the next 4 years, this territory passed into 4 different jurisdictions. The Michigan Territorial Legislature recognized this as the Iowa District, and that was Iowa in 1832, just this little strip here. The boundaries of these areas changed. The Wisconsin District is where we were in the Wisconsin District of Michigan Territory. In February 1836, 8 men gathered at the home of Colonel George W. Davenport on Rock Island and they formed a partnership and resolved to establish a city on the Iowa side of the river. And that was platted May 14th, 1836, while this was still Michigan territory, the Wisconsin District. Now, over the next 4 years, we start to see all these jurisdictional changes. Michigan becomes a state. Now this is divided into Wisconsin territory and Iowa territory. Finally, 1846, this becomes the state of Iowa. But by this point, everybody, Davenport has been in 4 different jurisdictions. So if you're wondering why there's a kind of historical, I don't know, antipathy might be a little bit strong a word, between Davenport and Des Moines. For example, does anybody here get the register still? Do they print Davenport weather in the red? No, they don't. They never have. It's like we're in a separate state. There's all kinds of things like that. And some of it results from this, that Davenport predates the state capital. Well, let's take a look at some of the historical texts, because a lot of what we have to do with these older texts is interpret, and that's where people have gotten into a lot of trouble. Davenport's first and the greatest historian of early Davenport was Frank Wilkie. Wilkie was a journalist. After leaving Davenport, after he published this book, he left Davenport. He went with the 1st Iowa Regiment to Missouri during the Civil War and covered their campaign. His reports landed him a job with the New York Times. And then later he became editor of president of the Chicago Press Club, longtime editor of the Chicago Times. Wilkie is a surprisingly modern man. He writes with a sense of irony that is very 20th century. It's almost Twain-like at sometimes. A great writer, a just penetrating writer. He's so modern that it's a little bit deceptive. We're kind of lured into a false sense of, oh, I know this guy, I know his world. That's how it's a very seductive kind of thing. And we have to keep our perspective in mind, because that's one of the things that you lose in history. As an example of this, consider this photograph of the Quad City Times building. Nobody's laughing. Oh, oh, a few people are laughing. All right. For those of you who are not from here, those on Zoom, those from other time zones, this is not the Quad City Times. This is the new Y. And this is not a Photoshop job either. All I did was crop this. Here's all I had to do. If you stand on River Drive at the southeast edge of the treaty grounds and look across 4th Street and the Quad City Times parking lot, you don't see 4th Street, and it just looks like the Quad City Times has this beautiful campus in front of it with the sign there. This is not nefarious activity on the part of the Times. The sign was there first, all right? But you can imagine if this were published in a history book and 150 years later, some schmo says, oh, that's a really nice building the Quad City Times had. So it's important always to remember your context and perspective. Let's go to page 27 in Wilkie and take a look, and you get a great example here, all right? Just 2 sentences about the capture of Black Hawk. He was sent in a few days to Rock Island. I see Molly and John. I see Steve and Darcy. You're from Rock Island, right? He's not talking about you, though. Where is he talking about? The island, what we would call Arsenal Island, all right? On the 21st of September, 1832, a new treaty. This treaty is known by 3 different names, and the one that really stuck is non-official Black Hawk Treaty. The others are confusing because there were a couple of treaties with the Saxon Foxes. There were a couple of treaties at Fort Armstrong. In consequence of cholera in the fort, the treaty was held on the Wisconsin side. Wisconsin District, Michigan Territory, on the spot of ground. All right, now this is figurative, right? For those of you online, I'm pointing at a speck of dust on the floor, right here. This spot, that's not what he means. He's using this in the 17th, 18th century sense, like, what a lovely spot for a picnic. We've got a brook, we've got trees, you know, that's how he's talking about it. And if you look at the context, the treaty was held. Well, there could have been up to 500 or 600 Indians. There were 400 soldiers stationed at Fort Armstrong. 100 of them died of cholera. There were draft animals. There were tents. There was equipment. This would take up a very large area. So he's using the word spot, not in the way that we would think of it. Now, very dangerous word. When is now? Does anybody remember? 1858. Now occupied by the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad buildings. All right, well, we'll have to come back to that. But for the moment, the Mississippi and Missouri became the CRIP in 1866. What we have here is Wilkie is describing the general area where the entire treaty took place. And if you keep it in mind, that's helpful. But this is only 2 sentences, and look at how many edits we had to do just to make this comprehensible to modern readers. So anybody who doesn't do that math is going to find themselves on the wrong trail, basically. Well, that's just a little bit on interpreting texts. Modern historians have found that a lot of value in interpreting artworks. This is where Bruce came into play. When I showed this to Bruce, I didn't give him any background. I didn't tell him what this was. I just said, you know, tell me what you see. And the first thing that he saw, he said, this is appropriately stayed for even a state capitol building. And I thought, wow, you know, you were really close to the mark. Does anybody know where this painting is housed? A guy who worked in the building knows. Yeah, this was not for a state political capital. This was for the state's financial capital, the American Commercial and Savings Bank Tower, just across the corner of 3rd Street. Originally named the German Savings Bank of Davenport, the anti-German hysteria during World War I forced the company to rename itself in 1919. 9 years later, the tower became the final step in this rebranding effort. Now, one critic has called the bank's architecture an ungainly hodgepodge, and you can see neoclassical, you see all these different things, but what stands out to me are the colonial, federal, and modernist elements. The cupola, the clock tower, the eagles, the triangular pediments, all this stuff shouts, we're American. The American bank. Well, the tower was also intended to be a symbol of the bank's identity with and importance to the community. And nearly a century later, this is still the tallest building in the region, and it's the defining feature of the city's skyline. The building dedication was held on a Saturday, 14 months before the stock market crashed. Ooh. The bank was open. This was a Saturday. The bank was open from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. They had an open house and 40,000 people showed up. Now, on an average business day, you'd see 5 or 10,000 people going into that building anyway, so that wasn't that unusual. Not everybody went to the top floor, although thousands did, but everybody went through the main banking room. This is the ceiling was executed by a Chicago firm in Neo-Italian Italian Renaissance revival. And around the exterior here, you'll see these frescoes are just little images from Davenport history. What's the one on the left? Who is she on the left? Note what she's got in her hand. She's the school teacher. That's how they identified her, as the school teacher. The first school in Davenport was 1838. In the middle, 1856, the arrival of the railroad, 1861, Civil War. So this is commemorating events in Davenport history. But the focal point of the art, these are the east windows. This building has excellent lighting during bankers' hours. But really, the focal point of this is that when you walked in, the first thing you saw was a mural by Davenporter Hiram Henry Thompson on the south wall of the bank. Bruce talked about structure, and he said, if you look, this is really carefully designed. He says, I really like this because it's a safe composition nestled underneath a Roman arch in a narrow space. And he noticed, you see these divisions. The table is in the center of an oval, which is reflected all the way up to the top. So it kind of almost gives you the impression of like a ship in a bottle sort of construction. And this is where it appeared. Now take a look. You see the chandelier on the right? That is going to obstruct your view. That's why he put the clouds. That's why he put the clouds there. So when you walk in, the action of this is taking place low enough so that the chandelier doesn't get in the way. Now, personally, I kind of wish that he had been given that space to work with. It would have worked a lot better with his subject. But after 25 years as a composer arranger in New York, knowing the kinds of crazy things clients will ask you to do, it was, hey, buddy, this is what we got. This is what you got to work with, and take it or leave it. So, of course, he took it. This forces some choices, artistic choices and compromises that we'll cover. Well, history painting, it was kind of an inspired choice for Hiram Thompson to choose history painting to try and tell this story. History painting died out in about 1850. Why? What happened? Photography came along, and it changed the name of the game. Who wanted to see a painting? Because it wasn't realistic. This isn't really realistic. Why not? There's no detail. You also have to tell the story in one frame. So you can't show sequentive action. Everything has to be told in one image. Think Gary Larson or Frank Miller. And even these guys had an advantage because, take a look on the right. That's a cartoon that appeared the day after Harold Hughes won the Iowa governor's race in 1962. He was the only Democrat who won. Everybody else is Republican. But if you didn't see, governor and all those, you might not know what he's getting at. So, and in history painting, you can't do that. You have to show everything in terms of pictures. So Bruce kind of said, there's no sense of where this is. how could you convey that? How could you convey where this is taking place? You can't just paint the Y or the Centennial Bridge or the Davenport Bank building in there, because then what are you doing? Yeah, you're mixing times. It doesn't work. So the challenge in history painting is telling the story. And so they futz the details, and they futz the details in order to show meaning, message, and moral instead. So let's take it apart. This is Major General Winfield Scott. He is standing in front of the flag because he is the senior leader representing the federal government. Seated at the table is Governor John Reynolds of Illinois. Now, he was actually a militia general in the field, but he's portrayed here in his civilian role as governor. Why is he seated and not standing? To
He's getting ready to sign the paper.
I hadn't thought of that. I think it has to do with the power relationship between him and Winfield Scott, because Scott is representing the federal government, and the state government is subservient to that. So even though Reynolds is a civilian official, he's still lower on the totem pole than Scott is. Commanding the troops is Major General William Henry Harrison. He's really known for two things. He was an Indian fighter with the nickname Tippecanoe, and he was the 9th president of the United States, but he was sort of a compromise candidate because by that time he was really old. The thing is, nobody remembers, and even in 1928, nobody remembered who he was because he only served a month as president and then he died. He was the first one who died in office. So I think if Thompson had painted William Henry Harrison as he actually looked in 1832, which probably would have been upper left, nobody would have recognized him in the painting. It's just like Washington. Washington was young when he did all this stuff, but we paint him as the old man because a lot of people don't recognize him as a younger man. This is Antoine Leclerc, who at this ceremony would have been dressed actually in the uniform of a U.S. Army major. Here, he's portrayed in buckskins, and that's to symbolize his role as pioneer and proprietor of the city of Davenport. He was the translator for the treaty, so he's translating this as General Scott is reading it. All the drama here is centered on Keokuk, who has the finest clothing of anybody here, and Keokuk was known to be a natty dresser. But it's also his body language. Keokuk is in an impossible position. He's been selected by General Scott to be their go-to. He's the guy that we're going to deal with. He wasn't selected necessarily by his tribe. And now he has to move them off the land. This is a guy who does not like what he's hearing or what he's going to have to do. Because there are only 18 figures in this. And yet there had to have been 1,000 people watching. Because he's got this narrow space to deal with, he can't show scale. So he has to show this in other ways. And he does this essentially by representation. So this figure over here in the articles talking about the opening of the building, they take apart this painting. And this figure is identified as Pashapaho. But there's never any explanation for why. There's no description of the figure. They don't really explain why that's Pashapaho. And I've often wondered why it is. And I've never been able to figure it out. Which makes me wonder that really maybe this is just a composite. You know, Wapello was there too, and there were probably about 10 or 12 other chiefs and big men. So it could possibly be that this figure is there to represent all of them, all of the ones who took over leadership of the tribe. Any speculation as to who this figure is? Black Hawk is one that a lot of people, could that be Black Hawk? Black Hawk wasn't there. Could that be why this figure is sitting? Some say that, hey, this could be White Cloud because he's dressed in white, or it could be Black Hawk, or it could be both of them, actually. When they were captured, just before they were captured, they sought sanctuary in I think it was the Ho-Chunk village in Wisconsin. And the women of the tribe made them both deerskin gowns in white because they're going to surrender. White flag. They probably didn't want to take any chances. So they're just going to dress all in white. And then they headed off to the agent at Prairie du Chien and they surrendered. So possibly that's why this figure is dressed in white. Possibly he's seated because he's been defenestrated of power. And maybe that's why all of these other braves are also seated. You know, the treaty starts off in the preamble, whereas under certain lawless and desperate leaders, they don't even mention his name. So it's possible that maybe all these seated figures are intended to represent those Sauk and Meskwaki who were defenestrated of power, the formidable band. The table is supposedly in the archives at the Putnam Museum. And when I mentioned this to Chris Costal, she said, really? She said, there's so much stuff there. They don't even know about it sometimes. But I think the table here serves another purpose. What is the table meant to signify? Why? Why do you say frontier? Because of the way it's made? Okay. Somebody said something up here. This is where they came. That's probably signifying the treaty itself, the place where they came to meet. What about the top hat? What's that there for? What could to keep the treaty paper from blowing away? Maybe. But I don't think history painters didn't do things casually like that. Everything means something. Well, we don't see this. So perhaps it's a reference that the treaty is dictated, that it's a one-sided treaty imposed by the federal government upon the Indians. This might also be a metaphor for Black Hawk himself. This is a picture of Black Hawk after 1832. He never wore Indian garb again. He always dressed in the style of the white man with a black frock coat and a top hat. So possibly this could be meaning to signify that Black Hawk is not there. Bruce also commented about the layout. You know, you've got the blues and the reds, and they're kind of arrayed like chess pieces. Let's talk about how a painter can use placement and arrangement to show power. And you see that some of these people are standing and some of them are seated. And I would bet that he has placed people vertically based on the amount of power that they have in the situation. Can't be sure, but that's my speculation. But there was something else that really troubled me, you know, regarding the blue and the red, left and the right and everything. And I couldn't really figure out what it was until I thought of this painting. Those of you here, this is Surrender of the Hessians at Trenton by Jonathan Trumbull. Where are the Hessians in this? They're on the left. This figure here is Colonel Rahl. He was the head of the regiment at Trenton that got routed. He received 2 mortal wounds. He was shot off of his horse. He was not standing. They lifted him up. They took him into a church and laid him on a pew. Washington came in and sort of, you know, said, hey, you know, do what you can for him. So Washington is portrayed in a gesture of mercy. with his right hand. Does anybody speak Italian? Diretto, meaning right, also meaning correct. What's left? Sinistre, sinister. All of which kind of now makes me wonder, all right? You've got all of the Americans on the left, you've got all the Indians on the right, and Antoine Leclerc is gesturing with his left hand. History painting is descended from the Italian Renaissance. This is no accident. Hiram Thompson went to art school. He knew what he was doing. What's he trying to say with this? Well, possibly this could be a reference to the Leclerc Reserve, Article 6 in the treaty, which gave Antoine Leclerc 2 square miles of land for his services as translator, right? When he was getting paid, just straight money for translation, he was not making a whole lot of money. This is a huge payment. Now, a lot of these treaties had what were called half-breed tracts that were where land was parceled out to families of people descended partly from the tribes. It's not really clear that that's really what this was, but it seems that they tried to make it seem like that, maybe. That's one possibility. So here's the reserve, the lower reserve. Yeah, go ahead. On the left, I'm not sure if these are like rangers or if they're just pioneers. My guess is pioneers because there were a few. Most of the accounts that we have of this were letters either by pioneers who were just kind of around, or they were soldiers and they wrote letters home, and then the letters got published in their hometown newspapers, and that's actually how we know that they survived. Iowa already, before the treaty was even signed, and it could have been one of those. And maybe they, if they came from Ohio or Massachusetts, they would write a letter, it would get published, and that's how it. I think that's what they're there to symbolize, because all the types of people who were there seem to be represented here. The soldiers are not properly represented. If they were actually represented as they were, 2 of these guys would be doubled over from the effects of cholera. Right. So there's your, the whole realism thing. It's not always a thing here. Who's missing? And there probably were a few. Who else? Probably. Oh, so I heard it. Yeah, right. Remember where we are. We're in a bank that symbolizes the community. Later on, the bank was renamed Davenport Bank, right? And he's not represented here. We know that he was there, right? He signed as a witness. He was Leclerc's commanding officer. He was the senior local military official. That he was not. There were very few people there who outranked him. I wonder if maybe this is just a statement about George Davenport's eventual, relationship, impact with the city that he founded, because he was only alive for 9 years before he was murdered, and the city didn't really take off until after he died. Antoine Leclerc and George Davenport's sons had much more to do with the development of the area than Davenport himself. Davenport is it's almost kind of a spectral presence in our early history. And so in a way, it's kind of fitting that he's not there, but I kind of think he is. And I asked Kristen Quinn about this. Now, she says artists do this all the time to it's kind of like what Bruce was talking about, laying out the painting in a way to show structure. There here, she thinks he might have just been creating a frame within a frame, but I think he was also trying to say something. If we go back to Frank Wilkie's description, and he's talking about the reserve. The Leclerc reserve was made on the single condition that Leclerc should build his house on the ground occupied by the Marquis of General Scott. John, what's a marquis? It's an automobile. Did they not use marquis in the army in the 60s and 70s? It's a tent. It could be an open-sided tent on a really nice day. On a windy day, you could block off one side to prevent the wind from coming through. On a really cold or inclement day, you could block off the whole thing. But could have been the size of this room, a huge tent that officers used as a mess hall, as a rec hall, as a place just to get out of the sun and relax. And that's where supposedly Antoine Leclerc built his house, was the spot where that marquee was placed. There are no straight lines in nature, but you see a shadow there. And my guess is that represents that George Davenport was watching this from underneath the shade of the marquee. And if you look at it this way, it's really interesting. The arch, the Roman arch and the gilded stuff around the edge, it almost kind of makes you feel like you're looking through a keyhole back in time. And so that's just kind of a tour of how history painting can be used to actually get at history. All right, well, let's go to the treaty site itself and see if we can't find out just where that house was. All right, here is the area. This photo was taken about a year ago, and these are all the structures that are there now. Oops, Astra came down about 2 months ago. That was an old building. I think that building was 125 years old. Something's still missing. Okay, that looks right. Where was the house in all of this? Well, let's go back to our sources because they're kind of giving us little bits of information in different places. Here's Wilkie again. The treaty was held on the spot of ground now occupied by the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad buildings. He's talking about the whole treaty. He's not really telling us where the house is. He's identifying this ground here. Once it became clear that the railroad was going to cross Antoine Leclerc's homestead, he agreed to donate the property and the house to the railroad. And then he built his mansion 2 blocks north and 1 block east. This is the one that still stands. Well, let's go to our second Davenport historian, Willard Barrows. Willard Barrows built this house on 6th Street at Rock Island Avenue. That's Pershing to you and me. Barrows was a surveyor, spent a lot of time among the different Indian tribes, learned a fair amount of their language, which he imparts in his writing. He's particularly great writing about the land and Indian customs. So he is probably our best expert on all of those. And it's a really rich narrative from that perspective. And we're talking about something that this might actually be helpful. The first improvements, meaning the first structures upon the ground now. When's now? This is 63, close. They were Wilkie and Barrows were friends. They were contemporaries. Now occupied by the M&M Railroad Depot. He's telling us now it's the building. That's the building where General Scott's marquee was. Okay. Now we're getting somewhere. This 1855 article is explaining what happened, that Leclerc gave the house to the railroad and they converted it to, and you can see how it worked. There was an office for the ticket and freight agent, and there were separate waiting rooms for ladies and gentlemen. And you can see the house had this three-part structure anyway. It must have been a really simple conversion. This building stood for about 17 years, and the railroad used it for that purpose until the rail line was moved. Well, then, that means we could just look up the depot in a city directory. And this 1858 directory tells us the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad Depot is at East 5th and Leclerc. This article from the Morning Democrat is an obituary for Louis Herbert, who worked for Antoine Leclerc and helped him build that house, which the article identifies as being where the passenger depot now stands. All right, so all these are connecting these different definitions of place. 1867, we can look at the CRIP depot. Now the city directories get more specific. Southeast corner, Leclerc and 5th. And we got a few more. This article from 1899 is actually condemning all the mistakes that a Chicago reporter made in his story, but it does impart some information of itself. By this time, the house is gone. And this article is saying the house occupied the present site, 1899, of the yard master's office at 5th and Leclerc. So I went searching city directories for the yard office. It doesn't really appear in a directory until 1910, but there it is, 5th and Leclerc. It does appear on the 1886 Sanford Fire Insurance maps, which are they're an amazing source. Special Collections has a whole bunch of those here, and they have so much detail. And there it is at 5th and Leclerc. In other words, all of the contemporaneous evidence tells us that this house was located at 5th and Leclerc Streets. Now, how many of you thought Farnham? How many of you have heard that? Because all the historic documents and all organizations and everything, they're copying this wrong history. How many of you have seen this sign at Farnham and Federal Streets? Well, it wouldn't be much help now, as you can see, because it's faded. And the information on it is wrong, right? It's understandable why this happened, because if Farnham and Leclerc Street, where that parking lot is, this is the center of the lot. So if you're trying to describe where the treaty was held, that makes sense. But it's not where the house was. Well, how did that happen? How do all these modern sources put the house at 5th and Farnham when it's actually at Leclerc? Let's see if we can track down the roots of underbrush. First, there are all these terms in 19th century history that will just drive you to drink. All right, house, especially block. I don't know. I don't think it's just a Davenport thing, because I know there's a building in Lamar's called the Union Block. Maybe it's a Midwest thing. Maybe it was a 19th century thing. But you have to be careful when you're reading. They could mean a building, and that's the more likely definition, actually. House is another one. So much confusion has been caused by a writer who says the Leclerc house or the Burtis house, and people think they're talking about their private abode. No, they're talking about the hotel. We're in a river town, so above and below often means upstream and downstream, not over and under. Besides terms, there's names. I'm just going to get into street names because this is a hot mess. Over the course of about 100 years, the city is adding subdivisions. There are subdivisions and plats going up outside the city limits that later get absorbed. There are duplicate street names. There are streets that don't agree. And finally, the city council stepped in 1900 and said, we're going to clean all this up. We are going to unify all the street names and any new subdivisions that come in, you've got to conform to the grid that we've already got. Sounds great, right? But 5 years later, here's a Davenport city map, and this is the street index. All of the highlighted streets have since changed names. This is 5 years after the reform. All of these streets have changed names in the last 115 years. That's more than half. All right. So as you go searching around for things, what you're going to find is things are in the wrong place because the street names have changed. Nothing's moved, but the street names have changed. Then there are names of other things and events that happen 2 and 3 times or in 2 or 3 different places. And it's like you need a new prescription or something. First is the treaty. All right. There were 3. The first one always gets forgotten. It's the treaty with the Winnebago or the Ho-Chunk people on September 15th. This is 6 days before the Black Hawk Treaty. And this kind of just people sort of forget that this happened. Antoine Leclerc translated this one too. Willard Barrows, I've only tracked one error in his whole book, and I call it a misprint because he's so meticulous about it. He puts the Black Hawk Treaty on September 15th. But what he's done is conflated the date with the treaty. It was the Winnebago Treaty on the 15th. It was the Black Hawk Treaty on the 21st. I'm going to call this the Barrows misprint, not to pick on him because I love Willard Barrows, but it's when you see this, it's really handy because it's like a forensic marker. This person copied Willard Barrows' language. And historians, this was common to do until the early 20th century. It was accepted practice for historians to do that because, for example, Frank Wilkie's book probably only had, I don't know, a couple hundred copies printed. And that book was impossible to find until internet publication, 10 or 15 years ago. So whenever you see this language, it's like hey, they read Barrows. Okay, that's actually helpful. But that was the first treaty. The second treaty was the Black Hawk Treaty. The third was the Treaty of 1836. So if you recall the green parallelogram, Keokuk's Reserve, that's the subject of this negotiation. And Barrows is the only historian who really gives us a precise sort of location for it. He says it's on the banks of the river above the city, Rivertown. He's talking upriver from the city, where the house of Mrs. Braybrook now stands. When's now? 63. All right. This really, really flummoxed me. And until I moved back to Davenport, I had no idea how to track it down. But I went into the city directories to try and track down Mrs. Braybrook. In 1861, I found her. But all it says is house, north side of Front Street, East Davenport. That's a pretty vague description. The early city directories, there were no house numbers. It was kind of vague. And who knows, that far out of town, there might have only been 3 houses there. So it was easy for people to find. You'll notice there's a Stephen G. My guess is that's her son. And Luce Lane and Company is the publishing company that published Frank Wilkie's book. So this is a town of 18,000 people. The interconnections there's probably only 1 or 2 degrees of separation. By 1863, it appears that Lucy Braybrook has died because her son, if that's who he was, is listed as the owner of the house. Now it's a little more descriptive. House, north side of Front Street, east of Summit. Here, I committed the cardinal error, right? I know where Summit Lane is. I'm a Davenporter. It's right below East 11th Street, just east of Mississippi. It's just a short little 2-block thing right here. Oh, so Mrs. Braybrook must have lived somewhere around El Dorado Spring, where the Children's Village at Hoover is now. But that didn't really satisfy me, but I was like, I guess that's as good as I'm going to get. Well, Virginia Schatz writes about how we peer at photographs and maps, for years sometimes. And I was just looking at this a few weeks ago, and all of a sudden there's Summit Avenue, which doesn't exist anymore. All right. These are fancy, fancy homes. And then I kept looking, and look there. Mrs. Braybrook. They actually identified parcels in 1857 by who lived there. Well, that means that in modern terms, Mrs. Braybrook's house was on the front lawn of Dick Davidson and Mark Sorensen. And I mentioned this to Dick. Dick is a lawyer at Lane and Waterman. And he said, where was the treaty signed? Because lawyers are all about the signature, right? And I was very pleased to be able to tell Dick, the documents only tell us where the treaty was held, not where it was signed. Very lawyerly response. So we can infer from this that Mrs. Braybrook's house marks the spot on the river, and that the treaty was basically held where the water company is now. That's a ledge that kind of juts out into the Mississippi, and that's where the treaty would have been held. All right, so there are the three treaties. The LeClaire House. There were three of them. One was a hotel. Two were the private residences of Antoine LeClaire. But you will find references all the time where they say the LeClaire House, and they're actually talking about the hotel, not one of his houses. There are some writers who identify the hotel as his second residence. George Davenport, there were two of them. All right, there was Colonel George W., who was the founder of the city, and there was his son, George L., who was an industrialist. He's the one who made the first land claim, the first official land claim in Iowa. He's the one who really built the city into an industrial powerhouse in the mid-1800s. So when you see stuff like this, wrong. There's Barrows and Burroughs. Willard Barrows was the historian and the surveyor. J.M.D. Burroughs was a businessman and a memoirist. And I got to tell you, his memoir is outstanding. It's outstanding. He confines himself to stuff that he knows, business, the different kinds of businesses that he was in, living in 1850s Iowa, banking and finance. It's a wonderful read. This is one of the, you can't make this up. Mayor Burwald and Mayor Bearwald, and they are only 2 years apart. This is just a few. I could go on for an hour just on this kind of stuff because it's all over the place, and you got to be really, really careful. It's just a lot of names and places and people and events that get confused all the time. Well, how does this happen? All right, you got to have some way of carrying the incorrect information. I think the wind here was the oral history subscription projects. There were two of these. The first was in 1882, written by the Interstate Publishing Company. Now, this is bad news when a book comes out and no one individual is willing to admit that they wrote it, right? So it's the publishing company that wrote this book. About 30 years later, in 1910, Harry Downer did an update. And these two books are widely cited all over the place, and they've got real problems, all right? First off, those of you who are here might not be able to see, this is by subscription. Think high school yearbook. And can you see how that's a direct conflict of interest with history? Because if you're writing a book for people who've already agreed to buy it, you can't say anything, even the least bit negative about them, because you're going to hear about it, right? So already your objectivity as a historian is compromised. Here's a great example from the library, from the Special Collections' own web blog. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about this. This portrait of dapper Gilded Age rectitude is Sam Smith. Everybody say hi to Sam Smith. Anybody know this story? I bet Katie does, but all right. This is his entry in Harry Downer's 1910 biography. All right. Samuel Smith, born on the 5th, it says he was born in Waterville, Massachusetts. It was Waterville, Maine. And you know what? I'll just save you a lot of work here, okay? Samuel Smith's father was a Baptist minister who penned the lyrics for My Country 'Tis of Thee. And all this stuff in gray is about him and My Country 'Tis of Thee, an ode which has found a merited response in every Christian heart, not only in this sweet land of liberty, blah, 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 blah. Alpine valleys on the slopes of the Himalayas, you know, this is purple prose. To be the author of that hymn is glory enough for one man and one lifetime. But let's go to his son now. Samuel Smith, a year at Harvard College, came to Davenport, entered the law office of Judge James Grant. James Grant was a lawyer, judge, and a Speaker of the Iowa House of Representatives. Admitted to the bar 1858. 2 years later, in 1860, he became a partner of Judge Grant. 49 years later, he died. You might be forgiven for wondering, what did this guy do in those 49 years that merited a place in this biography? Well, actually, he did an awful lot. He was a really important figure in the community. In addition to this, he was on the Iowa State Bankers. He was president of the Iowa State Bankers Association. He was on the boards of all these charities. He was elected mayor of Davenport on a reform ticket to follow Henry Vollmer, who basically instituted registration of prostitutes. This was the guy they put up to kind of clean up the city. Well, he just sort of kind of went along with it, realizing that politically he wouldn't be able to accomplish this. What all this misses is that Sam Smith was one of the wealthiest men in Davenport. So it was kind of a shock to everybody locally to discover that he had earned his money the old-fashioned way by embezzling it from his clients. And the Cedar Rapids Gazette put the figure at a cool 4.2 million in contemporary dollars. The story is actually more interesting. He was sentenced to 11 years at Anamosa. He served 5 and then was given parole because his health was declining. And he is released on August 5th, 1909. He gets on a train to go reunite with his family, who has moved to Boston, right? Because they just wanted to get out of Davenport after all this happened. And he's on the train in Toronto. He has a heart attack and he dies. So he's only free for 2 days. And there ends the story of S.F. Smith. But it seems clear that either his family wrote the biography or Harry Downer did, and he had to be very sensitive to their feelings. This was just the very next year, right? Can you see how this is not history? And can you see how the real story is much more interesting than this phony stuff? Just a few quick other things from the 1882. Part of the other problem with these is their methodology doesn't fit what they're trying to accomplish. The pioneers are fast passing away, whitened head, bended form. We should interview them while they're still here. Great. Get their story, find out, how did you survive that first winter? How did you negotiate with the Indians? How did you cook your food? How did you, all that kind of stuff? No, they want to interview these pioneers to find out stuff about facts, about the Black Hawk Treaty. And so, gee, what could possibly go wrong here? All right. I have to admire their candor, but not their per page batting average. And if there's an average of 20 errors per page, how do you know which one is which? And how do you know what one to quote? Just a few of the doozies here, all right? This is not history. This methodology is great for getting people's life stories for cultural history, but it's not good for this. Here are just a few, all right? This book also tells us that the Black Hawk Treaty was held on the banks of Iowa River. Remember the green parallelogram, right? And obviously they had two sources. They had Willard Barrows and they had somebody else, and they disagree. So they say, we'll just say September 1832. That's close enough. Page 260, we get the amazing fact that there were no settlements on the Iowa side of the river. You said there were how many?
10,000.
10,000. Squatters? Nah, no squatters here. There, look at that. This is the Barrows misprint, the 15th of September. So we know that they read Barrows, and in fact, they're pretty much duplicating Barrows' language, but they're substituting the modern things. So M&M becomes CRIP. But they make a little addition that wasn't in the original. Barrows just says depot, because at that point, it's just the passenger depot. But this says freight depot, which was at Farnham and Fifth. Now, they might have gotten this information from a really incorrect article in the Democrat in 1880, which did exactly this same thing. And then Harry Downer takes it the final step. He says, oh, okay, that's where the depot is. There's the depot, Farnham and Fifth. And now you fast forward to 1972 to a book by a Des Moines Register writer named George Mills. A big tent was pitched at what is now Fifth. Do you see what he did there, right? He's just conflating all of these accounts and all the... And this is what a lot of the histories do. And I guess my point with all this is you got to be really, really careful when you're interpreting this language, because it's going to lead you down the garden path. And that's exactly what happened. It's fine to use these sources for the things that they're good for. But my feeling is that we've reached a point where you just can't rely on them for fact anymore. If you're going to start talking about facts in early Davenport history, I think those of us who are historians, we've got to go back to research, and we got to just kind of start reconstructing everything. Look at the original sources and tell us, what are these things actually saying? I have just a few slides. My narration got too long, but I think you might find these slides really interesting because it just kind of shows the physical development of this area through 4 redevelopments. Here's the first, when the bridge went in. This was the original bridge. You'll notice that the center span, the draw, has an arched truss. And in about 1866, 67, the company retrofitted the other spans with this same thing for strength. This is, as far as I know, this is the only photo of the actual bridge. The first time I saw this was in Brian McGinty's book, Lincoln's Greatest Case. The Army decided eventually, yeah, we do want the arsenal for a base. And so they adjusted the right of way. This was the second bridge. Take a close look at those piers. They're still there. Once the right-of-way was adjusted, the railroad decided to redevelop all this area. This is the second redevelopment into a yard, complete with car shops, roundabout, roundhouse, all kinds of services. This was a really first-rate rail yard at that time. By comparing city directories with the 1886 Sanford Fire Insurance map, I was able to generate a pretty reliable image of what businesses were down here and what they did, and also their dimensions. And what you see is here in the upper left segment, this is still largely residential. You see apartments, we see laundries, grocery stores, butchers, boarding houses, even a couple of churches. But as you move more southeast, this is becoming more and more industrial. In 1892, there's still a lot of, you see the Lindsay and Phelps lumberyard here, and over by where the Gordon Van Tyne store is, that was also all lumberyards. 30 years earlier, it would have been lumberyards all the way. Now this is receding and heavy industry is coming in. The 1895 replacement was built on the same pier as the Iron Bridge. And its construction necessitated changes in the rail grade and the right-of-way. So the depot was torn down and moved 2 blocks west. And this little segment of track, neither the city nor the railroad wanted that. The railroad preferred an entrance to the yard from the east, and the city didn't like this because it was dangerous. It was an at-grade crossing. There's a portion of this track that's embedded in the pavement at 5th and Iowa that's still there. You can kind of wander around and see it. But in 1900, the company constructed a Y switch. This was a truck-eating bridge, basically. And here's a picture of it. 10 feet 10 clearance. And this picture was taken from that angle, that's the Hotel Blackhawk, and that is where Red Band Coffee Company is now. Yeah, looks very different, doesn't it? By 1915 or so, this area, the Y switch has the effect of kind of walling off this whole area, and it becomes even more concentrated industry. The addition of the lock and dam in 1935, they basically filled in various portions of the riverfront. And here they constructed a terminal, which was mostly used for grain and gravel. And that's the riverfront, late 30s. You can see the seawall there. You see gravel here on the left. Maybe that's probably gravel, and over here too. By the 50s, this is becoming an undesirable neighborhood for housing, and the housing stock probably had deteriorated because of that. And so at this point, there's very few people still living down here. And that trend really kind of continued. Gradually, businesses started moving out of this district, offshoring, and the French and Hecht works came down first in the 60s and then in the 80s. This photograph of the Great Flood of 65, here on the left that's the gravel pits of WG Block. That's where the Y is now. And on the right, you see the Robin Hood flour mill, which was humongous. It was a humongous building. This is a picture of it. That's the before and after. The building exploded on May 24, 1975. And at first the company said, well, we're going to rebuild, but they decided eventually just to pull out all their operations to Minneapolis. And again, this is part of that hollowing out trend that we see not only here, but all throughout the center of the country. The French and Hecht works were finally torn down in the late 80s. The Quad City Times occupied the site, but they had to do a ton of excavation to get rid of the coal tar. And as far as I know, this lot in Howard Johnson's, that building went up in 65. I would not be surprised if that was never abated. Not positive, but I wouldn't be surprised. When the Rock Island Railroad failed in 1980, how many of you know that company still exists? It's a finance company, Natch. So they're selling off all of their railroad assets. They tear out all the tracks. The Y switch finally came out, I think it was 1995 or 96, and it came out with a lot of difficulty because that was a heavy structure. But what you see now is this area is it's not only hollowing out, but the rail lines are all gone, the wall is all gone, and now the city has been redeveloping all this area. The grain and gravel terminal, it was turned into a park, which they have needed because they were never able to attract riverboats for lack of space to receive them. And so now we reach this point. I just have a couple of photo montages because I think these are really creepy. We didn't quite get the right angle on this. We were a little bit too high with the drone, but that is about where the bridge was. No, that was the other way. This was the French and Hecht plant right off the government bridge. This is the McClellan Mill Works. That's Lopez on the left. Same building. The Lopez building is still there. Shame they tore down that building. That'd be an amazing apartment building. And this one I took at the corner of LeClaire and what would have been Farnham. Farnham was closed 100 years ago, but this is the corner of LeClaire and Farnham. Just last Sunday. Take a careful look here. Gives you a sense of how big that thing is. And you can also see the rail tracks embedded in the street. Which? It blew up in 1975. Nowadays, this neighborhood is in its fourth redevelopment. And if you could go walking down there more often now, people are there for recreation, especially on the weekends. And you could be walking around and see an architectural artifact of something, and you might think that you're seeing a ghost. And if you do, take another look, because you probably are. And with that, got some time for questions. Thank you. John.
The Times building by the new line, there was a marker that said this was the first Rock Island bridge.
That's still there. I think it's positioned about 30 or 40 feet too far downriver. As far as I can tell from looking at photographs and maps and everything, the original rail line to the bridge was behind, you know, where there are sheds behind the Y, and there's a high ridge there. And I'm pretty sure the rail line went along that high ridge. Catherine, are there any questions from people online? Oh, the question was east of the Quad City Times building, there was a stone marker marking the place where the first bridge across the Mississippi crossed. And that's still there. Bruce.
Bucktown, right there.
Yeah, on the other side of the.
But I know it expanded. I guess I don't know where it really is on the map.
Where Bucktown was?
I mean, how extensive was it? How far they had out? Because they speak of all these saloons.
That was all on the other side. The rail line acted as a wall, as a buffer. So the saloons were to the west of that wall, extending to about Perry, maybe Brady, but Perry. This area on the other side of it, that developed into heavy industry very early. And I think it's because the embankment and the rail lines and the trestles all created kind of a wall. Oh, Bruce's question. What was the question again? It was Bucktown. It was the location of Bucktown. Oh, hang on, there's somebody. 2 chat messages. Please repeat any questions from attendees at home. Anything else?
House about his protecting slaves in the Underground Railroad.
I didn't get into that. I don't even actually know, I haven't gotten into his letters and papers are mostly held at the Newberry Library in Chicago. I think the Putnam has some. I haven't actually explored those yet. That'd be a treat to do. John?
I have another question.
Yeah.
Down in the village of East Davenport by the waterworks,
Yeah.
supposedly there was fungus fire, because that's where the firehouse used to have the lumber
Mhm.
all floating into the river. That kind of redeveloped that one.
John, the question for those at home is there was a huge fire in the East Village of Davenport in 1901, and the question was about how that
Affected the development to
I'm not positive exactly where the fire started. It went as far west as, I think, Tremont Avenue, perhaps. My impression is that it started about where the Lindsay Park Boat Club is now and kind of worked its way west. And I have seen there's a photo of the charred landscape afterwards that appears to be at about, I'd say Tremont Avenue or Carey Street, maybe. As far as I know, it didn't go over the bluff. I think it was mostly riverfront, maybe a little up the hill. Yes, Kathy.
State is basically taking the land from the Native people. Is that a theme at all?
The question is was there any angst in the historical record over the treatment of the tribes and that the government was taking the land? In the early ones, especially like the interstate history, no, they were sort of like, hey, this is what's happened, and rah yay. Where you really start to see that is more 20th century, and not so much in the historians, but in the literary folks. So Susan Glaspell, for example, we know that she read and was profoundly influenced by Black Hawk's autobiography because and you can, like, her play Inheritors is pretty much set in a fictitious Davenport, and she uses a lot of that history in that particular story. And the dialogue is very sympathetic. There is a change there. I don't know, as far as the historical literature, there's kind of a gap. If you don't count the oral histories, there's really a big gap between Wilkie and Burroughs and then the next crop. It was a long time. So, yes, Dan. Oh, Frank Mills. Yes, the treaty was imposed. That was correct. I was just saying, the sentence that was underlined, yeah, that was all. But yes, but see, Frank Mills, that was 1972. So by then we had Hispanic studies, Black studies, Native American, all that. That was kind of about when all that started. So by then, yeah, there was an interest. Katie? Yes. I haven't, I mean, I forgot about him. He's actually recapping, and it seems like a lot of his stuff is based on Downer also, because he puts the Fifth and Farnham thing in there. I had forgotten that he did, the book was squelched. He published in 17? Like he published his book in German, and the war started like 3 days later. It was one of those things. So his book was squelched, but then he did run major portions of it in serial form in the newspapers, and I have run across those in special collections.
He got a lot of information from reading the newspapers.
Well, he was an editor, and he edited one of them, and there are also lots of anecdotes about him leading a very lonely life and spending most of his time in this building, like until 2 o'clock in the morning, which I'm glad you don't have to work until 2 in the morning, Katie, but it'd be nice if it was open still.
Interesting note on Ralph Baginski,
Yes.
put in the bridge. That was the very first bridge he ever designed.
And the very last one.
Was the I-74, the one span, 1932.
Yep.
Between those two spans was the Golden Gate Bridge, which wasn't that big.
Oh, it was like 50 or 75. I mean, he designed a bunch of them.
He came over from Poland.
Yes. And it is kind of, it's one of those fascinating things that, oh, his first and last bridges were here. Not seeing anything else online, and we're just about out of time. So thank you all for coming. I hope you had a good time.